Hello and welcome everybody to our new episode on systemic thinking, systemic therapy, counseling and team supervision. My name is Jens Förster. I'm a systemic coach, therapist and supervisor, and I'm here in my office at the Systemic Institute of Positive Psychology in Cologne in Germany. So you might be already surprised why I started this presentation in English, because usually I do it in German and I explain to people how systemic therapy works. I would present methods, I would present theories, I would present new ideas that might inspire therapists out there. Today I have a surprise for you, because today I have a special guest here, Nira Liberman from Tel Aviv University. Professor Liberman actually designed, together with Yaacov Trope from New York University, the Construal level theory of psychological distance. And I thought it would be important to talk about distance, about psychological distance, because this is an important psychological factor. And we have experienced distance the hard way during the last 1.5 years, during the corona crisis, right? I mean, we couldn't see our relatives, we couldn't meet our friends. We had to do internet counseling, teaching and supervision. And we wondered what might be the difference between live coaching and, for example, internet coaching. And thus I had the idea to give Nira the opportunity to present her theory to practitioners. So in part 1 of this film, she will just present to you Construal level theory of psychological distance, and we will discuss a little bit the implications for everyday life. And in the second part, we will discuss together the implications and applications for practitioners, because this is a theory that has gained a lot of attention beyond social psychology. Nira is a social psychologist, and it is a constructivist theory of psychological distance, as you will see. However, the theory was applied to marketing research, to decision making, to research on self-control, and the next step, I think, would be to apply it to therapy. I would also like to add that I am an editor of this journal. It's a Systema, a German journal on systemic thinking, coaching and therapy. And it is the journal published by the IF Weinheim, the Institute for Systemic Thinking, Development and Education in Weinheim, Germany. I'm a trainer at this institute and I'm also an editor, and I will publish a shortened version in English and a shortened version in German in this journal. Before Nira will present, let me say something about her. Nira obtained her PhD in 1997 at Tel Aviv University, and then she became a postdoc at Columbia University in 1996. I met her and we were basically very close together. We were just stuck in a tiny office and we became best friends. After her postdoc at Columbia University, where she worked together with Walter Mischel, Tora Higgins and Yaacov Trope from NYU, she became a faculty member of Indiana University, Bloomington, and afterwards she moved to Tel Aviv in 2001. She became a faculty member at Tel Aviv University. Nira studies mental representation. She's a social psychologist. She's a constructivist. She does research on decision making and self-control. And she also, and this might be important to some of you, she also developed a new theory on obsessive compulsive behavior. However, this theory will not be part of this presentation. Nira is one of the most prominent researchers in the field of social psychology. She received many awards. Maybe the most important one is that she recently got elected as a member of the Academy of Sciences in Israel. Okay, Nira, and now the floor is yours. Please present to our audience your CLT, your Construal level theory of psychological distance.
Okay, thank you, Jens. Thank you for inviting me here. And I really am glad to try to think with people about the possible meaning or implications of this theory to therapy. So, so psychological distance or ongoing beyond me here and now. And the first thing I would like to actually present to you is the idea of psychological distance. And the idea is very simple, in fact. We directly experience with our senses only ourselves here and now. Like I sit here in my son's room, actually. It's decorated with all kinds of heavy metal posters. You don't see them, but they're here. I hear the air conditioner and I feel cold. And this limited experience is all I have through my senses. Anything that I do not experience here and now is psychologically distal. And it could be distal because it is somebody else's perspective, what other people experience here and now. Or it could be hypothetical rather than real, what might have been, but never actualized. Like what would be the case if I sat in my office at the university? Or it could be distal in space, what happens now on the street outside. Or it could be distal in time, future or past, what happened before, will happen before. None of this we sense with our senses. And actually there is a continuum from proximal to distal. Things could be very far in time or proximal in time, although not necessarily part of the immediate experience. I don't see tomorrow, I don't see a year from now, but tomorrow is closer than a year from now. I don't know what Jens thinks. I don't know what any of the viewers of the video would think, but I have a better grasp of what Jens thinks because he's closer to me than people whom I don't know at all. So how far we go, and this is what we call scope. And the idea is that humans and probably or certainly other animals have to deal with the here and now. I'm hungry, or I have a stone in my shoe that hurts me. I have to deal with those things. So this is a necessity. But how far our concerns stretch in space, time, social perspective, or probability is a matter of choice or something else. But in any event, it could vary. Do I care about distal people? Do I care about global warming? Do I plan for retirement? Do I take into consideration unlikely events? So this is scope, how far my concerns stretch on all the different dimensions of distance. And we could think that individuals, institutions, stages of life, and even situations differ in their scope. And it could be either expansive, which means that they go far, they have far-reaching considerations, or it can be contractive, remain close. Sometimes I'm trying to park my car. At other times, I'm fighting global injustice, right? And it is interesting to consider when we do what assists what. It is also probably true that the expansive scope, the tendency to go far, is a later development of human cognition. So most humans are typically more expansive than other animals. Most animals do not take perspective of others. Our competitors are ravens and apes, but even they don't save for retirement, right? They can take, they can cheat, they can think what another ape or raven thinks, but they do not do it to the same extent as we do. It probably developed over human evolution. So for example, major cornerstones in human evolution, like language or rituals, involved actually traversing farther distances, uniting larger groups of people, making conversation over larger distances in time and space. So for example, 2 million years after the onset of tool making, humans developed function-specific tools. So they went from this one here, you see my cursor, right?
Yeah.
They developed from this one here that served humans for 2 million years to these guys here. And the idea is, or the important aspect of them is that they require constructing of multiple alternatives to reality. So you sit and you make a tool that you will use in a future situation that is probable. It's not certain. So you say, I'm going to make this, whatever this thing here, because I might meet a fish that I will need to scrap with this thing, right? These older tools, on the other hand, not only they were one for everything, they were like one, they were supposed to fit every purpose, but also they were disposable. So I needed to do something, I would do this tool on the spot and there I will forget it. So they really represent lacking foresight and lacking ability to think about future and hypothetical situations. Expansive scope probably developed with human civilization. So now we're on a different time scale, not of evolution, but of civilization. We're into the last, whatever, 10,000 years. In that period, we travel larger distances, form larger coordinated social groups. We also dig farther into the past and consider less likely possibilities. And also we could think that major cornerstones in human civilization involve traversing farther distances, like the development of agriculture, of writing, of print. They're all, you can look at them through this lens of expanding the scope of time, space, social perspectives that we traverse. And also, expansive scope develops from childhood to adulthood. Around the age of 4 or 5, children develop social perspective taking, they develop the ability to plan for the future, and it all starts with pretend play, right? So they all develop pretty much at once. Probably they're related to each other, but that's we don't have enough data on that. We can actually ask the question, do they develop together? Do pathologies in these abilities develop together? These are all very good questions that right now are underdeveloped, but that shouldn't stop us from thinking about it. Okay, so how do we expand scope? And the idea is very simple, actually. We start with the notion that the distal is unknown. We cannot know what will be tomorrow. We do not know what other people feel or what could have been. And more distance introduces more unknowability, more variance. A year from now is more different from now than tomorrow. A stranger's perspective on this talk is less known to me than Jens's perspective. But traversing of distance or expanding the scope is made possible because we use abstraction. So the idea is that it is impossible to step into the same river twice, as the proverb goes. And this is because by the time we step into it, it has changed, right? So that is true. But if you abstract a general category of rivers, you introduce invariance into this endless variety, and then you can predict. You can predict useful things. You can predict that if you step into the river, and when you do that, it will feel wet and cold. And that is useful. To connect with more distal times, places, social perspectives, and alternatives, we need to apply more abstract, or what we call high-level construals. And that is because to take into account more unknowability, more variability, we need to use more broader categories. So for example, food compared to pizza applies to a broader range of people, a larger scope of times, places, and alternatives to reality. So people 2,000 years ago ate food, but not necessarily pizza. If you go to an unfamiliar culture, you are certain that they have food rituals, but you cannot be certain that they necessarily eat pizza, right? So we are able to expand the scope by using abstraction. In that sense, abstract constructs are bridges across time, space, and social perspectives. They are bridges across psychological distance, and they are the tools that make it possible to expand the scope. And this brings us to the basic idea that more distal objects would be construed more abstractly on a higher level of construal. I should probably say something about abstraction. The more formal definition that we now use is that abstraction occurs when two or more subjectively distinct objects are deemed equivalent for a specific purpose. So for example, tea and water are drinks because both of them have the same function of quenching thirst, or exercising and dieting are equivalent to each other because they are ways to maintain good health. Now, note that when we categorize those things together under the same purpose, we deem them equivalent, we gloss over differences. So we say for the purpose of maintaining health, we gloss over the differences of exercising and dieting, right? They are equivalent, although we know they're different, we treat them as being similar. And abstraction depends on purpose or context. So exercising and dieting are equivalent in some respect, but they're not equivalent in another respect. It designates some dimension as the primary, central, and important, and that is the dimension of similarity. And the other dimension that we gloss over is deemed as secondary or unimportant. The act of abstraction becomes more difficult to the extent that the dimension of difference is more salient and the dimension of similarity is less salient. We can skip on, it's a little bit technical, but you can imagine what it means. Or maybe we could actually say something about it. Sometimes abstraction is difficult. It's not always difficult. It is difficult when you are asking me to ignore something that I know is important and is salient. So think about a child who studies arithmetics. Right, so they tell the child, you tell the child, we were told that 3 oranges and 3 paper clips are equivalent to each other. Both represent the number 3. Now you are asking me to ignore differences between oranges and paper clips. They are really, really different things. And the differences are important, but you're asking me to ignore those differences and be able to say this is 3 and this is 3. And that makes this act of abstraction very difficult. And the other perhaps acts of abstraction that are less difficult. When we categorize together cats and dogs as animals, perhaps that's not that difficult. You can pet both, they have 4 legs. It's probably less difficult. So that's what this number 3 means. But what is the most important aspect of abstraction is that it introduces invariance within variety and therefore makes it possible to traverse psychological distance, to go beyond myself here and now and expand my scope. So although I am confined to my senses, I can only see myself and smell and hear what is here around me in a relatively small distance. With the force of my mind, I can go to very far places. I construe them in my mind using abstraction. And that is kind of like the core of the theory. There are many types of abstraction, and we don't need to talk about all of them. I mentioned broad versus narrow categories. This is the example of, you can say poodle or dog or animal. And of course, broader categories are more relevant for a larger scope of times and spaces and social perspectives and probable events. Gestalts are more abstract than their elements. When you see a gestalt, you are actually invited to ignore the elements. And when you ignore them, you kind of say that they are unimportant. When you, in every abstraction, there is a statement that something is unimportant, right? And when you form a gestalt, you state that the elements are not important. And this picture here on the right is actually from the Beijing Olympics. And this is a gestalt of a trophy. It's made of people, and I think that's the reason why some people found it troubling, right? Because there is a statement here that the people are unimportant. What is important is the gestalt that they form. The decision on figure and ground is a decision about, is an abstraction. The same thing about primary and important things versus incidental and more peripheral elements, goals versus means, desirability versus feasibility. Goals are important, goals are abstract, means are more concrete. And this means that means the way we do things are interchangeable vis-a-vis the goals. Theories are abstractions over data. Symbols are more abstract than analog representations or simulations. And of course, we have the social abstractions, ideology, general attitudes. They're all abstract dispositions. In contrast to what? In contrast to concrete, contextual, pragmatic considerations or incidental influences, right? So all these are social abstractions that have been researched. So what we are saying is basically that you use more abstract constructs when you think about more distal events, and also that using abstraction makes you see farther, makes you makes it easier for you to think farther in time, in social perspective, in probability. And the reason the theory has been productive is that there are many ways to think about all these aspects. There are many situations in where distance and construal come into play. We have been doing research on just mental imagery or how people represent things, on decision, on prediction, on communication. So for example, we use more abstract language to communicate to people who are more distal to us. Or when we want to communicate social distance, we use more abstract language. So if I wanted to communicate to Jens social distance, I would say, dear Mr. Förster, which is more, in some sense, more abstract. We were talking about learning and goal setting. Then we have the different manifestations of distance. I talked to you about the 4 main dimensions of distance: time, social perspective, probability, and spatial distance. But there are also things that are not distances, but they are related to distance, like social power, novelty. Jens and I used to do research on novelty. Ownership, my things are close to me. The things that I don't own are probably more distant from me. And numerosity. Numerosity is interesting. This is the idea that perhaps when we have many things, they become distant from us. It's under research that deserves attention. Then related to can be seen from 2 perspectives. One is the distance influences the way we represent things, and then influences also downstream consequences of representation. But we can also reverse the direction and talk about how the way we represent things affects their distance. So that's another interesting thing. And I also already mentioned to you the idea that abstraction has many facets, and that's also many of them are interesting to examine. So pretty much any combination here, you take one element from each of these squares, and it comes, and you can think of an interesting research question around it. Some of them we actually studied, many of them we did not, but perhaps the more interesting question in this context would be, can we think of clinical implications, or even perhaps more broadly, implications for human life? So thank you very much. I didn't bore you with research results as I promised to Jens, but if you are really, really interested, you can read in these reviews or the many papers that my lab produced over the years, and of course my collaborators' labs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nira. This was a fascinating talk. It is a theory that I really loved from the beginning, I have to say, because I was the one who could actually observe the origin of it in 1996 when we sat together in an office in Columbia University. And it is just amazing how it develops. And actually, I would invite all the people that are interested to just look at the literature and at the empirical results that this theory produced. And I think this is part of the quality, that it's very inspiring, that a lot of people, a lot of researchers internationally from all over the world came up with hypotheses about the relationship between abstraction and psychological distance. I mean, at least this is the main correlation that I see in the theory, and that is terribly important. And I would say, yes, it is very, very important for everyday life. So I think everybody made this experience that if you have a conference a year ahead, you are completely excited about it and you want to go and you sign in. And as closer the conference gets, it becomes more nasty. Usually, it becomes more concrete. You have to think about, the passport, and now you have to think about the corona, the rules, and everything. And the closer it becomes, the more concrete it becomes. And in many events, it becomes also more negative. But I also understand that this is not always true. You also have research that sometimes the more concrete level is the more pleasant one. And this is maybe something that I think is terribly important for our specific audience, for the systemic groups, because it is not a theory about right or wrong, right? It is very context dependent in whether abstraction or concreteness is good or bad, and good or bad actually is not a dimension of this theory. It is very contextual. Am I right with this kind of interpretation?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think this example that sometimes, you need to take the little stone out of your shoe, and that's what you need to do, or park your car. And sometimes you need to worry about your retirement, and we need to function in these different scopes. And it's not that, taking the stone out of your shoe is bad and saving for retirement is good.
Let us talk later about the implications for therapy, but just, let's discuss a little bit the theory so that our audience gets what the beauty of this theory might be for real life, for everyday life. So just to get a better grip on the theory, let me take an everyday example, such as, for example, traveling. Traveling actually involves going to distant places, right? I mean, you meet different people you haven't seen before. Would traveling actually lead to a more abstract mode of thinking, to higher level construals, as you would say, to expansion of scope? What would you think?
Yes, definitely. I mean, definitely, you would expect, people who travel to have a better abstract or more abstract ideas. I'm sure it's true. Like there is this the person after whom the Flynn effect is named. The Flynn effect is the increase in IQ over the years, mm-hmm. which is huge. But he was actually a moral philosopher. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And he was interested in why morality changed over the generations. And his idea was that like in my language, it would be that morality changed because people acquired better ability for abstract representation. Mm-hmm. So they acquired the ability to think what if. So you can think what would be, what would I feel if I were born Black? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Would you think that perspective taking involves distance?
Yes, definitely. Yes. It's like we think of it as traversing social distance.
It's traversing social distance in a way that I kind of try to enter your mind, which is of course impossible, that we know from system theory, that I cannot intrude your mind, but still I try. So now and then it's, in our words, it would be some kind of a metacognition, because I try to simulate your brain in the best way I can, because I cannot really get out of myself, but sure. I will try, and I will just, it works like via expectations, that I will try to think what you expect from me, what I expect from you, and then basically try to figure it out. And I can be very, very wrong with this inference. I can be right. The better I know you, probably the higher the likelihood that there is something, similar to what I think you think about me. But still, it is, and in this way, it is similar, I think, even to systemic thinking, because it involves metacognition. And you also said that it is difficult, and we know that metacognition is difficult. It is a frontal part of the brain that is used for it. It's effortful, and that's interesting, actually. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we connect to theories, that are, you can go from really like the theories that think of perspective taking as in terms of accuracy, and it's very, you're talking about the advanced perspective taking, right? About understanding emotions, about understanding my situation, my take on the conflict. But actually, if you strip it from this like complex stuff, then you might think that that even like basic interaction with the person involves some perspective taking. Mm-hmm. That if I communicate to you, I humanize you, right? On some level, I cannot longer pretend that you do not exist. Mm-hmm. It considerably, it makes it less likely that I will kill you or something, So once people communicate, they are less likely to ignore each other and to dehumanize each other. So it does involve some basic perspective taking. There is a big, I think, gap between this basic perspective taking and what psychologists sometimes talk about, which is real understanding, right?
Yeah. I see. Or the illusion of real understanding. But there's another concept that's called empathy, and this feels more like an inner process than, for example, perspective taking. Some people would say that perspective taking is more the cognitive level, and empathy is more the feeling level. Is this? Can you relate this to Construal level theory? Or is it maybe even the difference being that empathy is more concrete and perspective taking more distal, or?
It's very interesting. I think it would be very interesting to try to distinguish between a situation in which you kind of like put yourself in the shoes of another person, right, so to speak, and then you perceive the distance from their perspective. I don't know, and you really cognitively construe it. Yeah, I mean, the thing is that, as you said, I mean, you don't really know. I mean, you think, right, that you take their perspective, but it's nevertheless a construal, right?
Yeah, it's hypothetical, of course.
Yeah. So like you empathize, like a mother empathizes with her child, right? So she really, really feels, but she can still be entirely wrong.
Yeah, of course.
It is still a construal, and so the fact, and I don't think that you can really kind of like completely take out the distance. It's there. I mean, you don't know. You don't have that experience of the child. You can be very emotional about it, but it's still not the same thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the other feature of this theory that I think is terribly important, not only for therapy, but for everyday life, is that space, time, and social distance are related to each other. That sounds terribly interesting to me, because in language, we have metaphors like that. So for example, I feel close to you because I like you. This means that I'm socially close to you. You are my friend. And this feels close. And of course, this also finally ends in more meetings with you than with other people, maybe. Yeah, and which makes it also closer on a spatial dimension. Can you give examples for like the relationships again between space, time, and social distance, and even hypotheticality, so the likelihood part of this?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting idea that when we expand the scope, we expand actually all the distances together that it there, because they're somehow related. And so, for example, when people build, more roads and they reach farther into the distance, that also means that they now visit people who are less similar to them, and that expands social scope. Now traveling farther also takes more time, so now they also have to plan farther in time. And now you also have, a larger physical scope, so many more unlikely events become part of your scope. So for example, flooding, right? Flooding in Germany, right? Flooding is unlikely, but if you have a large scope of the entire country of Germany, then the unlikely becomes less unlikely. So the distal becomes a little bit closer. But so they are related to each other. In many ways. And as I mentioned, also children, when they expand their scope, and that happens around the age of 3, 4, 5, everything happens at once. So they learn, they start pretend play, they start being able to delay gratification, to think about the distant future. They acquire the notions of time, what is tomorrow, what is next week, and also perspective taking. So that is developmentally, I think. It is very interesting to consider pathologies from this perspective. So my older son, he has been diagnosed very early on with attention deficit disorder, and attention deficit is about impulsivity, right? So it's around time, right? It's around not being able to delay gratification. So you could think it's on the dimension of temporal scope, or in fact, inability to have a large enough scope. So you are in the here and now. but actually, and then at the age of 16, we got a diagnosis of autistic spectrum. Now, autistic spectrum is defined actually around social perspective, right? Social perspective taking. And it is related, or what they call in clinical psychology comorbidity. This is, but it's okay, comorbidity, fine, but the interesting question is the mechanism that produces this relation. And also interesting is the aspect of it that is not even talked about as far as I know, which is the dimension of probability. And I think with many kids or many, I think, pathologists, it is somehow related to the, what one of the therapists called in my rich history, holes between reality and fantasy. So if I want something, that means it exists, or it should exist, you know, and this like kind of weak distinction between reality and non-reality. And this is kind of like, you could think of it as kind of like contractive scope on the dimension of hypotheticality. You cannot leave something that is out there, hypothetical, like appreciate the distinction between hypothetical and real. And maybe, I don't know, delusions and mentioned. So I think it's actually interesting that there's not much research about it, but I think in practice there are things that are related to this idea of pathologies having in common the difficulties in expanding scope.
Well, I mean, you can even relate this to so-called depressive symptoms, that you are sitting there and it's all about your self, basically. It's all about your suffering. There is no way to find subjectively any solutions. You don't even think that there are solutions out there. Yeah. And what we do in therapy sometimes is just to open the door. And that's also a metaphor, you know, to open the door, to expand the scope of finding new solutions, of finding or searching for your resources that you already have. Or you can also put another metaphor to it, is that you are very narrowly focused on something, yeah, on your pain, on your situation, and on the negative. The focus is on the negative. And expansion of the scope could already be to look at the positive aspects of life and about your skills, talents, capacities, resources that you actually have, because otherwise you wouldn't be alive. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the keys where I start working with patients and clients to tell them, well, that just the fact that they are here, that they're coming here to my office, shows that they can do something. Yeah, that they are starting a self-regulation process, and that this doesn't mean or that basically reconstructs their idea of being completely helpless. You know, and but well, I mean, if I think about it, it's kind of working with similar metaphors, like opening doors or opening the room of solutions rather than the room of problems. So they're sitting in the room of problems, and basically they go out to search for a room of solutions, right? And
yeah, I think expanding the scope is a good metaphor, actually, and that that in many situations it's relevant. So you expand the scope and you let other people in, you let other things in, right? And sometimes even physically. I think even just letting other situations in, other similar situations in, is also useful. It's like kids in tantrum, you know. So when they are in a tantrum is one thing, but when they are able to say, I'm angry, it's a completely different story. Because once they say, I'm angry, you can ask them, okay, how angry are you? Is it kind of like the worst angry that you have ever experienced, or where would you put it on the scale of angry experiences that you had? And that is also expanding the scope, right? Because then I make you think about like other situations and scale the current situation against those things. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, one of the methods actually in systemic therapy is using scales, and scales have a lot of interesting features. So if, for example, you ask your clients about their mood, and you offer a scale from 0 to 10, and 0 is very bad mood, 10 is very good mood, and they say 5. That's already an interesting start for a conversation, because you then can ask them, what do you need to get a 6? Right, and this already kind of expands the scope, because they usually don't think that they can even move. But if they say 5, it kind of is a suggestive moment of this scaling, right? That you think, okay, let's do a 6, or do you even want a 7? Or and then the subjectivity of the scales is also very important. That you ask a client, so what is your ideal? Is it 8 or 9 or 10? And of course, people differ, with respect to their standards. But still, there is always this question. So it can be better, it can get worse also. What do you need in order to get a 5? So what would you have to do in order to worsen your situation? And I think what we do from another psychological level is just offering more perspectives, rather than the one they are in. I mean, this is like, I offer 2 perspectives. If I say you can also get a 6, or feel a 6 after this session, or a 4 or a 3, and well, this is one of the reconstructive process that probably is part of maybe any therapy. But for us, it's a concept to reconstruct.
Yeah, you know what? It's interesting, that my mind always thinks of research. It would be interesting, like it's obvious, as you said, that once you do that, people expand scope, and it's interesting to try to measure how much they expand scope. So, like, they expand scope because they bring in like other situations. Like, let's say, well, in order to be 5. In order to move to 6, I would do this and that. And that's hypothetical and future, but how future and how unlikely? That's interesting. It's interesting. And it's also interesting, there is a tiny distinction, or not tiny, but actually that we're struggling with. It's underdeveloped, but it's in one of the papers, we go there, which is a difference between expanding scope, where you actually kind of like do the way, you travel the way to include the other person's perspective, and just fantasizing about the distal place without going that way. So like, there is research on the difference between planning and fantasy, right? So in planning, you have a picture of the way to the future point, the future desirable point. In fantasy, you only have the distal desirable point, but you don't represent the way to it. So it's interesting if maybe sometimes it looks like expanding, but it's not expanding. You think about the distal situation, but it's not, it's without the way of going there. So if a client says, yeah, in order to go from 5 to 6, I need to, I don't know, get my dead father alive and
talk to my brother, or
and
clear
win the lottery. That's in some senses expensive, but it's not really. it's different. It's different than going the distance, and just like jumping the distance.
Yeah.
And that's why I think that just like one more thought is that sometimes we think that distances collapse around us. And one way in which they collapse is that it used to be the case that in order to meet a person, I don't know, in Mexico, you needed to actually go to Mexico, you know. Then you would cross the border, you would be immersed in Spanish language, you will be exposed to different food, to different smells. You had to really invest all this effort and appreciate all the different, and only then you would meet a Mexican person. But nowadays you can meet a very different person from you, from a very different over the internet, and that's a complete anomaly. So you kind of you go the distance, but without really appreciating how distant it is. So it's kind of like a tiny bridge over that distance. And it's funny. It's So that's the paradox, right? The paradox of the modern world. So in some sense, we are expanding, but in another sense, we don't need to cross the distance anymore. Because I can find, you know, the person who is exactly like me, without ever needing to talk to people who are different from me. At least, maybe, I don't know.
Which brings me to the new situation that we have. We have a lot of internet counseling, internet therapies, and if I ask people, so how does it feel? Usually they are very, very satisfied with the result. So you can actually do this. I mean, we, you know, now have been communicating for more than an hour, and it feels like fun. It still isn't the same, of course, if you would drink the coffee together. And sometimes it's difficult for me to really describe the difference, because it works. I see your face, I can see your emotions, and as a therapist, I can efficiently work with this, and I actually even prefer this situation over a situation wearing masks, because then something is really disguised. So what I don't see is, of course, your legs. If you are nervous, I cannot see you moving your legs and stuff like that. But from my experience, that's not so important. And of course, people need treatment right now. There's no way that we cannot do this or can say that Zooming, Skyping is stupid. I mean, we do this, it's efficient. But how would you describe this difference? Because it is being close. I mean, even like if I look at the room now, you're very close to me. Still, it's distant, of course. You are in Tel Aviv, I'm in Cologne. How would you construe this situation? Is this even applicable to the theory? Let's go back to the theory. Maybe that's easier than just describing the feelings involved. But how would it fit?
I think it's an anomaly, right? So as you said, I mean, typically distances go together, which means that you typically live around people whom you like, and you like people who you live around, and you are more likely to meet them, and it will take less time until you meet them next time. So all these distances go together, like social, spatial, temporal, hypotheticality. They tend to go together. Sometimes they're violated. So sometimes, for example, you have a very close friend who lives on another continent. This happens, but then it's an anomaly. What it means is that it produces what they sometimes call friction. It feels wrong. There's something wrong about it. So there is a sense of wrongness, and there is a pressure to fix the wrongness. To either, so sometimes relationships, like long distance relationships, are at the dangers. We know, right? We know that. Or there is a pressure to close the spatial distance, to go move together. I mean, so that we understand that. Now the question is, I think, whether people experience remote communication as an anomaly that calls for fixing,
Mhm.
or
Mhm.
not, or would they adapt the type of communication to the new medium?
Mhm. Mhm. That's an interesting part, because what I can see is, for example, if I do seminars and trainings, I've been doing this for 1.5 years now, and I'm getting the best results, because, and then if I look at the results, there's no difference between like giving seminars in presence or via Skype or Zoom. But then if I ask people, when I meet them eventually, they tell me that the presence is a huge difference, that it feels much, much better, and that they won't go back to Zoom or to Skyping. And that's an interesting part, because it is such a discrepancy between the immediate results, the immediate evaluations of the training. You don't see any difference. So it's all, yeah, great and stuff. But then what I think is probably the result is this feeling of wrongness, this feeling that there is something wrong with it that would not be felt if you just sit together in the old-fashioned way, just in the seminar room on your chair, having your coffee together. Still, I mean, it's a more complex difference maybe, but I just think that, yeah, I mean, it feels, I can relate to this. It feels wrong, but is it the case because we are just not used to it? I mean,
I think it goes back to what you said earlier, is that, I mean, it's just different. It's not like better or worse, and you can adapt to it. You can take actually advantages out of it. And I think there are advantages, and people will learn to use them, but it's different. And I think it's not better or worse. It's just like another thing. And it's interesting to think about how to capitalize, how to make the best out of the distal communication. And it has been around in teaching too. So in teaching, I mean, universities introduced all kinds of things, more videos, more games, more group discussions that are easier. And these are all advantages. And the disadvantages are there too. So now we have like 2 types of therapy that you can do, like in person. And I agree with you that it's very interesting to articulate the difference and to kind of like design slightly different sessions. I'm sure you are already doing that.
Yeah, but is it, I mean, would you predict that we talk unconsciously, maybe more abstractly via internet counseling? I mean, would this be a predicted effect by your theory, or is it too fuzzy, the situation, that you cannot even predict anything? What would you predict?
I think we could predict it. I think unless, okay, in principle, yes. I mean, you think you are supposed to do like to be more abstract, unless you actually want to overcome the distance and make and try to bring people closer. And then one of the ways to do that is to talk concrete. If you talk concrete, people would feel closer to you. So if you say things like, oh, look, I have here my son's posters, then people feel close to you because you kind of like, you gave them this little detail about your life, and that's very concrete. But it's part of the same theory, right? It's part of the same theory. So now you use concreteness to close the distance gap. Instead of like reacting to the distance by being abstract. I think also abstractness comes from not only from the remoteness of the audience, but also from this idea that you are being recorded, and that some people will watch you in a different situation. So for example, I was not sure if like giving this example of flooding in Germany is such a great idea, or because maybe people will watch it in some, I don't know, 2 months from now, and they will not know what the hell I'm talking about already, because everything will be forgotten. So you having like right recording makes you kind of like abstract, try at least should make you try to abstract yourself out of the specific situation.
Yeah. But then, this would be terribly important because people just ask me, how to do therapy via internet, via video communication. And one of your advices would be, if you want to create closeness, social closeness, then watch your language, basically, observe your language. And one of your recommendations would be to be more concrete. Is this what I can take? Of course, I know you, and you always contextualize your such recommendations. It's not in every situation, but as a, as one of the advices you can give on the basis of your theory would be to be more concrete.
Yeah, I think be more concrete, or situate people. So we are here together, so we are in two different rooms, but give me a little, if you want to, you don't have to, a little tour of your office.
That's funny, because intuitively this is what we do. So one of the rituals we have in our institute is, if I have like many people, I ask them to go through their apartments and to find some symbol that kind of signals or reflects their mood or their self, and then I put, for example, like the animals like this, and say, I feel like a goose, I'm alert, and stuff like that. That's something that we actually do intuitively in order to create something that's more cozy. I think this was the intention. And of course, to use the space that we usually don't have. We are not in the apartments of our clients. And one of the ideas, I think, was to use it, to make an advantage out of it. But I think we never thought about that this could create closeness, that this could create some kind of feeling of being closer to the clients.
Yeah, that you can. It's interesting that you nevertheless share a situation, right?
Yeah. We share a situation. There is some similarity because everybody has to do it. This is also maybe creating some kind of similarity. And there is something, we had some research that's showing that a similarity might be related to closeness. Dissimilarity is more remote, is more something that creates distance. It's already in the words, but maybe it's not trivial that if you create differences, this might also involve some kind of abstractness and might create some kind of distance, which is also not good or bad, but it should be used with some consciousness involved, that we that this could have different effects.
Yeah, I was in some session where they asked people to change their names, but not change, like, it's not that I'm not Nira Liberman, but they add like something to the name, like I don't know, session with Jens, Nira Liberman, Tel Aviv University, something, and then there is a something that unites, you see on the screen a name of a person or a title that is created for the situation. And it is, if you have like a few participants, it's the same across participants. So that's also somehow unifying them. And yeah, so it creates some...
I see that you put something like, for example, the name of the company behind your name, and
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or the conference, or
the conference, or something, or
Well, but which brings me also to the other tool that we use a lot in systemic therapy, and we call this externalization. So if I ask, for example, people to represent their problems using material, like, for example, using sheets of papers or like these cards, and I tell them, okay, so this is your problem, this is your disorder, this is your theme of life. And they look at it, you see at least I can observe immediate changes in their mindset. So they kind of start thinking about the problem in a completely different way. Well, you can think about it as some kind of embodiment effect, that it makes it feel like, you know, it's now haptic. You can have a grip on it, which is something also like a embodied metaphor. But it also might involve, I mean, how I would usually explain it is that I kind of, that it enhances the likelihood of the meta level, that you look at it from an outside perspective. But you can also construe it, if I follow your theory, as an instance of distance, right? Or is it too far-fetched?
I think that I just think that there is more to it than distance. I think there is some right tangibility, control, and externalizing. So so distance is part of it, but I think it's richer. This particular metaphor is richer than just distancing. I think what is more related to distancing is really seeing the system, perhaps. Is like really looking at the forces in the field. I mean, it's really like, it's kind of like redefining the situation in a broader way, which actually says, you think of it, for example, as, you know, being about this particular instance, but let's think about it as being part of a larger whole. That would be more akin to distance, and I think it's a bit more difficult and a little bit more abstract, and that's, I think, why the what you described is perhaps more effective.
Yeah, I think this is something that even adds more complexity. If we go for systems, for example, this is another method that I would ask clients, for example, to draw a picture of their family, of the entire system, or, you know, they can do it like this, for example, if this is the father, the mother, the brother, the sister, and then you can sign, you know, yourself, and you can talk about your position and stuff, and we use it also as a method to look at the entire system, to have like kind of this eagle's perspective, to have, but which is the meta level again, to look at it, and then to also, of course, experience the function of your problem for the entire system. I mean, that's what systemic therapy is about, that a disorder or a problem is not only part of the person who experiences it, but it is stabilizing the entire system. So it is functional in a way for the entire system. So, for example, a disorder, so-called disorder of a child might stabilize the entire family system. So the child is only a carrier of the symptom, but actually the system is actually the one who has the disease, but it's just attributed to one person. And I mean, in order to do this, you cannot do this with kids, of course, this way, but for adults, it is sometimes a new perspective to think about disease or problems in this way, that it is part of a bigger system and it's not about yourself only, which also, of course, carries a lot of different and more complex factors, but it also appears to me to be, yeah, it produces a new perspective on an old problem, maybe, but it could also increase distance, and it also could increase the abstraction level of the perspective.
Yeah, I think like for example, a person would say that, okay, I have a problem. I had this like terrible fight with my father. I don't know. So my father passed away, so it's not relevant. So it's always used sort of easier to give this example that is not real. And then you can say, okay, so the problem is the fight, but on a larger scale, the problem is not the fight. The problem that you love your father and you care about what he thinks about you, and the problem that you think that he doesn't appreciate you. So there is a bit, like on a bigger scale, there is a different problem. And the different problem is, as you said, is more abstract and oftentimes more systemic, right? Because then there is, you know, you think that the father loves another child better or something, you know. So the fight, so people think of the fight as the problem, but the problem is not it. The problem is deeper.
Yeah. About the interaction, it is about, you know, where it starts, which is sometimes very, very difficult to define. So when would it start? That's Václavic with this kind of, you know, where would you start saying that something is wrong? It is a construal, actually, where you put the starting point of the conflict.
Yes. I mean, it's definitely, it's kind of like zooming out of the situation, which is difficult, right? Because it's these situations where we have this, you know, little stone in the shoe that makes us really want to take care of it. It's about it. It's now. The fight is now. I want to be there and cope with it. And then you ask me to zoom out of this situation and think that the problem is not it. The problem is different.
Yeah.
And once you redefine, you come back with a different insight, and it really changes the situation. So I think that's part of what your the systemic therapy is probably.
Yeah, maybe this is also the difference between behavior therapy and systemic therapy. The behavioral people would just look at the stone in the shoes and would do everything to get it out, right? But it is the systemic view, as you said. I mean, it's of course it is important to get the shoe out, the stone out of the shoe. But what would happen? Probably the systemic view would imply a distant view, distance perspective, that it could happen again. And what would the person then do? And of course, we would like the person to be able in the next situation to put out the stone of the shoe and to get like a more broad perspective on it, you know, a more expanded perspective. What could be wrong? Why this person has always stones in his or her shoes? And this could be, and there we are on the meaning level, which you also refer to as an abstraction, that I kind of make sense, maybe on a broader level, that I ask myself, what does it mean that I always carry stones in my shoes, which is also a perspective that takes it away from the here and now, because it means that I, as a therapist, want to prepare the person to be able to get the stone out of his or her shoes.
Yeah, you know, the stone is not a good example, because the stone suggests that it's really, I mean, you should do it, and that's a good solution. But sometimes I think the immediate problem is a deadlock. It's a conflict that doesn't go anywhere. You know, it doesn't go anywhere. And then like going out of there is a good idea, and going like abstract and more distant. And you ask what it is really about, and the really about is not about this particular situation. And you say the underlying, you know, is different, and then it's then that's a good move sometimes when the concrete is a deadlock.
Yeah, and the concrete. Yeah, and sometimes maybe this is a situation, for example, what we have, if people are in a crisis, if they lost their home, like now when in the flood. I mean, of course, the perspective is narrow. This is what we know from research on bad mood, on crisis, on pain. And that's okay, that's maybe natural, but it is also not very useful in order to go a step further, right? It's just, kind of an impairment at the moment. And if people are ready for help, or if they are ready for support, they probably need a change of the concreteness into abstraction. And I can also see a point where it's the other way around, but maybe this is more unlikely, where people are kind of very fuzzy, vague, diffusive in a way, and they need more concreteness.
Oh, yeah, that definitely happens too, right? I mean, it happens in different situations that you think, about the meaning of life. It like in all kinds of narcissistic, distorted, like about what it means about me and about my achievements, and you want to do something more concrete. It's not about your, life career. It's about like writing this little paragraph. And this paragraph has no bearing on what kind of person you are or how great you are. It's just like a little paragraph, and you do it. So sometimes it is useful to narrow down.
Right. Yeah. Because I mean, the narrow focus could also enhance concentration or focusing on something.
Yes, and the grand meaning is sometimes paralyzing.
Yeah. What I also found inspiring now by talking about it is that you say sometimes there is a friction or a tension between all kinds of different distances. And what I think is also that sometimes in the methods we use, we do both, but subsequently. So for example, if I ask participants to imagine their life 5 years from now, which is usually helpful. It's called now regnosis because you look back from a point from a point in 5 or 10 years, and to look back and have a new perspective on your problem. What you can then do is to ask, well, probably this is a distant focus, right? You just go 5 years ahead. But then you can also ask, so what did you do in order to be there, in order to survive, for example, or in order to solve your problem? Because most of the people say then that 5 years from now, they don't have problems anymore, or they have solved the problem. And then you can ask very concretely, what were the strategies you used? What were the resources you used? So tell me how you did it. And then we are again on the how level. So what I kind of now realize is that we sometimes do both. So we first put them in a very distant, abstract mode of thinking, and then ask them for the concrete.
You ask them to cross the way. So you put them in the fantasy, you put them in the 5 years, and then you say, okay, so how, how will we get there? Paint the trajectory over there. So it's really expanding the scope, and it's not this like more pathological fantasy building, so it's really expanding the scope, and expanding the scope means that you cover all the ground in between. And not just jump, with the parachute.
No, but then you go backwards, and I think this is something that we experience is much better than have a prognosis. So what do you think? Would you do? Because this usually produces anxiety. That's I can never do this. But just putting them first on the place where everything has been solved. So this is your solution point, and many people say this. So for example, young women who are autoaggressive, who cut themselves, if they ask them, so would you cut yourself when you're 50? They usually say no. With 50, I wouldn't cut myself, Dr. Förster. It's ridiculous. And then I would put them to the place and say, okay, with 50, you wouldn't do this anymore. So what did you do yourself, in order to get there? And that's funny because everybody would, all the clients would come up with different solutions. So it's not that I can like abstract from the many solutions that I I listen to, but people find out their own ways to cope with it. It's very individual, and that makes it, I think, an efficient method. But I think now I got it. It's like playing with abstractness and concreteness, because neither of them is good or bad. It's just you can maybe activate thinking by switching levels. I mean, this is where I'm right now. Maybe it's efficient to sometimes switch.
Yeah, and I also think what you are saying is that people actually do have the scope, right? So it is true that we do care. We do have a perspective on what we will be in 50, when we are 80 in our case. It's just that sometimes you don't have it in your system, because right now you have the stone in your shoe, right? So because of the stone in your shoe, you are oblivious now to this perspective, but it's not that you never really had it or you never lived in it.
Right. It's not reinventing, it's rediscovering, right? I mean,
right, something like that. Yeah. Or people do care, it's not that people, never think about retirement. They're just too busy to really plan it. So we help them, right? So that's the idea of really nudging them or helping them consider the expansive scope. Now, the other thing that is perhaps important in this context of self-control and self-regulation is that when you when you are thinking about an expansive scope, you can think system, because then you can think about how the different things are interdependent, because it's complicated, right? So once you take into account the more distant future, you have to also think how it affects now, and how what you do now affects your life in 5 years from now, and so on and so forth. So you by definition, you introduce more stuff that you need to think about. And once you introduce more stuff, you also introduce more complexity, because the stuff might be interdependent. It's not only more stuff, it also kind of like they also affect each other, the things in between, and that's, I think, what the strength of the system perspective. But in the narrow, you are also oblivious of the interdependencies, and that's the I think the strength of the narrow view.
Yeah. I mean, that's my experience. But when we ask people about their resources, which we do because it's resource-oriented therapy, right? We want to know what they can and what their skills are and what their talents are. People usually don't know. I mean, and of course they have it, and also what they also most likely forget is that resources could also mean friends, other people, their relatives, that they can if you ask a more stable person about resources, they immediately come up with, I have friends, I have a good relationship. But this is what people tend to forget if they are in crisis. And sometimes they have this idea that they have to solve their problem on their own and that there are no other people around. So they kind of lose the feeling of interdependency and of being part of a larger system that also can help. And this might be the reason why they sometimes ask people for help. Are the distances related to each other, and what is the possible relevance to psychological coping and psychological problems?
Oh, right. I think we touched on it, but I think they're interrelated in reality. I mean, so like things tend to be distal or close on many dimensions at once. So, right. I mean, so it takes more time to travel farther. Typically, right? Typically people whom I like live closer to me, or I love more people who are closer to me.
And for coping and psychological problems, how Could you use this?
Yeah, this is the idea that perhaps if you have a problem with scope on one distance, so for example, if you are an impulsive person, which typically means that you do not plan for the future, that would also imply that you have problems with other distances, that you are also bad in social perspective taking, and you are also bad in considering hypothetical possibilities. And that would, there are different pathologies that are associated with this, like impulsiveness is over time, social perspective taking is kind of like autistic spectrum, and the dimension of hypotheticality is like confusing reality with fantasy. It functions in, I don't know, delusional disorders or stuff like that. Psychosis. So that would imply some kind of like comorbidity between these things. Maybe, I don't know. It's interesting. It's interesting if they come together. I mean, everything is comorbid, right? But I mean, it's interesting to think about the possibility that there is something common to all these things that is actually disorders of scope or of distinguishing between the near and the distant.
Yeah, I just have this this feeling that that this is terribly interesting, or it might be terribly interesting. If this is true, then you can also use different access to so-called disorders by using different distance dimensions, right? So, for example, if you have what you said is impulsive disorders, and this is more about time, you probably as a therapist would be inclined to talk about time. But one of the new access dimensions would then to talk about room or social stuff. And this might in itself be a surprising new way to talk about this for a client who probably has undergone therapy for 20 years with the same problem, but it might be a new kind of access. And this sounds again systemic to me, because sometimes it's just useful to find a new access to talk about a problem, right? Because it kind of disrupts the pattern of talking about it. It disrupts the narrative. And this could also I mean, we are speculating here, of course. This is not research, and this is not, it's about your research, but I use the theory in the way Goodluin talked about it. A good theory is much broader than the findings it already produced, right? And people listening to us can easily take away our ideas and can do research, you know, and to
actually help people even.
Or even help people. That's even a better idea, right? And try it, because I think that there is sometimes to it that sounds familiar to me, that you just try to find new creative ways on the basis of such a theory, for example, to talk about a problem. And
yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting. Like more, even like my son, who I said he is autistic spectrum. So if think about like distal places, and that is perhaps maybe it's even useful because it's more concrete. It's easy.
It's more accessible or something,
yeah,
or it's
like how things are in different places, how they are. Yeah, interesting.
Thank you, Nira. I mean, this was a very, very inspirational talk, and I gained a lot of new insights and new ideas for therapy and counseling and team supervision. I don't think that the list is even complete, what you can do with this theory. And as Goodluin said, a theory is so useful because it can be used for practical things, right? I mean, it can be used for everyday life, and it's not only an abstract kind of thing. So what we try to do here is actually to put something very abstract, like a Construal level theory of psychological distance, to the office And we would be interested in your feedback, your questions. If you want to do your research on it, just do it and let us know. And thank you very much, Nira.
Thank you.
Have a good summer in Tel Aviv, and I hope to see you soon back in Cologne, where you are a fellow at Cologne University. Thank you, and have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Jens.
And never forget, everything could be very, very different.